Well, welcome to Dairy Livestream. I'm your host, Corey Geiger, managing editor of Hoard's Dairyman. We are broadcasting from our cheese cave here, our studio in downtown Fort Atkinson at the historic W.D. Hoard & Sons Company building commissioned by Wisconsin's 16th governor, W.D. Hoard. Our conversation today will focus on, can U.S. dairy exports keep growing? I'm so pleased to have four thought leaders who delve into dairy export matters on a regular basis. As a reminder to our audience, this webcast will be available on our Hoard's Dairyman YouTube channel 24 hours after the live event. Dairy Livestream is also available anywhere you listen to podcasts, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. So if you enjoy this audio performance here today and the video performance, share it with your friends. Search for Dairy Livestream from the convenience of your smartphone to download it. After you hear from our panelists, please submit your questions into the GoToWebinar question panel. The earlier you ask a question, the more likely it will be asked on the air. Let's get rolling with, can U.S. exports keep growing? Before we hear from Megan Sheets, let's go to our first poll question. What country had double-digit gains in U.S. cheese purchases in the first half of 2022? Your options are Japan, Mexico, South Korea, all of the above, or none of the above. So go ahead and answer that, and we'll see what you think before we hear from Megan. So people are, over half of you, I can see it behind the scenes, are giving us the leading answer. So let's go ahead and see that. We have a very astute audience. The correct answer is all of the above: Japan, Mexico, and South Korea. So Mexico's our best trading partner when it comes to purchasing dairy, and then all of Southeast Asia is a very large growing area. So as Megan Sheets will pull out shortly, the appetite and sensory attributes for cheese do vary from region to region. And let's welcome Megan to Dairy Livestream. A University of Central Missouri graduate, Megan earned a Master of Business Administration degree from that school. After working with Midwest Dairy, one of the nation's regional dairy checkoff centers, for 5 years with focus on consumer insights, Megan joined the U.S. Dairy Export Council, where she is now the Senior Director for Strategic Development and Insights. Megan, your market intelligence reflects that U.S. dairy product exports have climbed to 17% of total U.S. milk production. Even though long-term trendline indicates milk production will eventually return to its growth patterns of the past, dairy product sales could be on pace to reach 20% of U.S. milk production in short order. Can you tell us more?
Sure, and thanks so much, Corey, for having me. I've been really excited and looking forward to joining this conversation today around the future of dairy exports. I know it'll be a really dynamic conversation. So to kind of reiterate what you said, I think is a great kickoff for the conversation, which is that it's roughly 18% of U.S. milk production is currently going into our overseas markets. And what's more is that's projected to be 20% in the upcoming years. There are two other statistics that I think are really foundational for the conversation today that I'll kick us off with, just to really kind of paint the picture of the landscape for exports. One is that we know that dairy exports are growing at twice the rate of domestic dairy consumption. And then the other is looking at global market share. So in 2020, it was about 20% is what our market share was globally. And now this year we're at 25%, which is quite the increase. So yes, we have some great momentum. The future is looking very optimistic for U.S. dairy export growth, but of course it has to be a soft yes. We have a somewhat complicated current environment that we're all familiar with, and so I will share a little bit about sort of those short-term, more macro factors of consideration that I would consider to be more of headwinds, and then we'll talk more about what's foundational that gives us a positive story to tell for long-term growth. So with that, one of the first short-term macro factors to talk about that is a challenge would be logistics. That's something that we're all very familiar with at this point, the logistics, the supply chain challenges. On Strategic Insights at US DEC, we lead a lot of B2B customer research. And one consistent learning that has really stood out to me since joining US DEC is that for the US to be positioned as a global supplier of choice, we have to have a consistent and reliable supply. That's something that continues to come through. And we know that addressing those supply chain logistics issues is such a big part of this. I will say one message of hope here. I met with our economist, Stephen Kane, earlier this week, and he shared some numbers with me of what's happening over at LA Long Beach Port. And it was earlier this year, there was 100 vessels waiting to dock. And now just last week, that number is less than 10. So that is something that we think congestion is beginning to ease, and we'll see kind of what that pattern looks like in the future. The second, though, short-term challenge to discuss with you is related to inflation, another unpopular topic. We're facing these high prices, and we've been really closely monitoring, will inflation impact global demand? And we are starting to see that consumer pushback with the high prices. That's something we continue to monitor as consumers' dollars really are being stretched. And then the third challenge to talk through is the tight milk supply here in the US. So we really haven't fully come back yet from the contracting herd at the end of 2021. However, looking at June data for US milk production, we were starting to see a turn, a little bit of growth. So looking ahead towards the end of this year, we do think US production will be flat to maybe some slight growth. So that also may have a more optimistic outlook in the midterm future. So despite these challenges, and it certainly is a challenging environment right now, we do have some really solid foundational, I would say, outlook for long-term dairy growth for exports. So I'll talk about three of those as well. The first is pretty big, which is the lack of milk from our key competitive regions. So especially New Zealand, Europe, looking at their slower milk production because of some structural issues, environmental regulations. It's really opening up the door for US to gain additional market share and continue to build on the growth of market share momentum that we currently have. And again, that's something that's projected to continue into the future. The second kind of tailwind to bring forward is this really, almost booming cheese demand that we're seeing across the globe. So in many markets, we're seeing a growth in cheese consumption. Apparently people really like cheese. And with that, what's really positive for US suppliers specifically is the cheeses that we're seeing grow in consumer demand align really well with our US portfolio of cheeses. So in some markets, it's cream cheese, some it's mozzarella for pizza, other markets we're seeing growth in cheddar. So with that, we find it to be really strong that not only is this growing demand, but we're producing the right varietals for that demand. And then from a competitive positioning standpoint, this is the topic I really like talking about, is USDAC commissioned research last year kind of acknowledging this growth and momentum we're seeing with cheese in the global marketplace, where we're really wanting to understand the actual sensory attributes that consumers desire in a good tasting cheese. We know that cheese has got to taste good. That's why we buy it. And what tastes good to you and I might be very different than what tastes good to consumers in South Korea or Saudi Arabia. So with this research, we were able to have those really specific sensory attributes that consumers are looking for in cheese, to where now we can be more competitive, we can be more forward-thinking and innovative to ensure that we're continuing to meet this global demand for cheese, and how we're able to approach that in a really strategic way. And then, so that's kind of covers the cheese demand piece. And then the last tailwind to talk about is just this growing interest across the globe in health and wellness. And from an international perspective, really what we're seeing is a focus on nutrition, which really pairs well with what we're seeing for a demand for proteins. So we're seeing an increase in consumption of protein sources across the board, all different kinds of protein, but specifically consumers are looking for high quality dairy proteins to fulfill their nutritional needs. And when we're stepping back to think about this trend with health and wellness, I think oftentimes we think of it here domestically with our consumers locally in the United States. But recently at USDAC, we had each one of our international offices get up. We have 10 international offices. They gave a presentation to our staff saying, hey, here's what's really important to local consumers in our market. And what came through very clear in each market consistently was health and wellness, sustainability. Health and wellness, sustainability. And of course, there were some nuances and different trends that were unique to each market, but that strong interest in health and wellness we know will fuel demand for many different dairy categories. And then specifically, you know, we're thinking of the whey protein isolate, whey protein concentrate, the demand for those whey products, specifically with the increase that we're seeing in consumption of proteins. So to wrap it up, to really summarize here, yes, we do have some short-term headwinds that we're facing, logistics, higher prices, this tight milk supply in the US, yet we do have that promising longer-term outlook for export growth based on the lack of milk from our key competitors, this growing cheese demand, and also the growing global demand and need for dairy proteins. And ultimately, what it comes down to, I mean, we believe we can continue to see growth if we have, one, product to export, and two, we can remain competitive on price in global markets, and both of which we're fairly optimistic about for the future.
Thank you, Megan. And I really appreciate the insight on some of our largest shipping ports here. Also know that there's been some reports, one in particular I read in the Wall Street Journal, that freight actually coming to and from the Asian ports is actually starting to drop off its record highs. And that also will be an important, it's been a headwind that we've been facing for some time. So let's go to, before we turn to Robert Chesler, I'd like to remind everyone to, if you have a question, go ahead and put it into the GoToWebinar control panel. There's a question portal there. We have some questions that already have come in. And so let's go to our next poll question here. In late August, USDA raised its 2022 dairy product export forecast by $1.1 billion to reach what? So basically, short question, how many dollars of dairy products could the US export this year? That's really what we're looking for here. Options are 6.5 billion, 7.5 billion, 8.5 billion, or 9.5 billion. So we'll go ahead and wait to see the answers to that poll question here. And we've, as an industry, have experienced some great growth here, and there's a lot of members throughout the industry that are working together to fulfill these sales and to open new doors and reach new customers. So we're right past the 50% poll mark here. So let's go ahead and see what the audience is thinking. So Robert, this is a question and answer that's near and dear to your heart. The audience says 8.5 billion. The good news is the number is actually 9.5 billion with a B. And if achieved, this would be a new record building on last year's 7.8 billion. And that number was up 18% over the prior year. And so those are some big numbers. We welcome Robert Chesler to DairyLivestream. From 2005 to July of 2021, Robert worked for the StoneX Group in multiple roles, culminating in his position as Executive Director for Global Food and Dairy. This past July, Robert joined the United Dairymen of Arizona, overseeing a team of well over 300 employees and a co-op that handles 4 billion pounds of milk production on an annual basis. Robert, you shared with me that the question isn't if U.S. dairy exports will grow. The question is how the collective U.S. dairy community will answer the export call. Could you please expand on those thoughts, Robert?
Yeah, absolutely, and thanks for the segue, and thank you very much for having me on, Corey, and thanks to everyone on this panel here. It's a great and esteemed panel to be associated with, in a wonderful industry with a multi-generational opportunity at our fingertips right now. And that's exactly what you've touched on, Corey. It's not if, it's how. And what do we focus on? Are we focused on a notional dollar value of increase when we don't really directly impact the notional value directly day to day? There's macro supply and demand impact, or are we focused on volume and margin associated with said volume? And it's that margin of volume that I think becomes core importance to our producers, who are the foundation of our industry at large. I would say it's largely accepted throughout the global industry today that the EU and Oceania are going to be supply constrained here in the short to medium term, maybe longer. which means that the United States has the opportunity to answer the call for increased supply because of increased demand. What that means is a tectonic plate has shifted. We're going, for the first time, arguably in 100 years, from a supply-driven market to a demand-driven market. Will we answer the call, and how will we answer the call? First part is, will our farmers increase milk production? And the answer to that is economic incentive. And that is addressed by how do we increase our exports? Do we simply send more commoditized product, more low heat, non-fat, for example, around the world? Or do we invest with our foreign customers as partners, long-term and strategically, into more value add, higher margin products, so there's a better return for our farmers, which then incents them to create strategically a larger milk supply pool for our customers. If we don't answer the call strategically, and if we don't answer the call in a unified fashion as the US dairy industry, then we'll miss the greatest part of the opportunity. Our foreign competitors are already making these changes because they see their milk pool under pressure. They're investing further upstream into higher value products, knowing that they might have less milk, so they want to make higher margin products. We need to continue to invest strategically as a US dairy industry so that the quality, the bell curve of the quality of the US dairy industry is seen better, and improving by our customers overseas, so that they become our partners, our cheerleaders, our supporters, as opposed to our captive customers. And that's done through strategic investment. That's done coast to coast, east to west, north to south, and the middle, so that we can seize the opportunity in the right way for our farmers. That means we have to move product to places we haven't before. We have to rotate it to places that we have before, but maybe not in as large quantities. It's not about who's the better customer or better region of customers. It's simply a fact of where is the greatest return for our farmers, our producers, so that we can incent more production, so that we can continue to increasingly answer the call in a strategic fashion for our industry at large. When we do it the right way, when we do it in a unified fashion, when we invest strategically upstream into our customers, we're going to seize that market share and become a preferable supplier as opposed to a supplier of last standard, last need. Now, it doesn't mean we don't need help. We have logistics concerns, touched on the ocean freight, there's railroad concerns, there's need for government support and trade agreements. There's a multitude of factors that we need to work in concert, but it all starts with appreciating the customer, working with the customer, understanding what they need, and investing strategically in a long-term partnership fashion so that we can produce the right things to move them to the economically incented places so our farmers have a future. Our farmers are fighting some really difficult situations right now. I'm going to use an expression I used a moment ago. The tectonic plates have shifted. Think about ethanol. When that changed the grain and feed situation, that was a government action. Now it may not be a government action, but the situation with water is that major tectonic plate shifting type of event. We're going to see a decrease of cows consistently for years to come in areas where we used to have a plethora and increasing number on the West Coast. Those are going to be moving probably towards the Midwest and other areas where there's more availability of water. We're under a feed constrained environment. It costs more money to make milk today from those areas, as well as labor, as well as other things that we're not going to change in the medium term. And if we're going to do that, we're going to have to incent them through profitability, through the right relationships in the right places with long-term strategy behind them, so that it works for the entire supply chain from farm to fork. And I think that's what we're doing at large right now. I'm very impressed by this US dairy industry, as I always have been. We just always want more faster. And if anyone deserves it, it is the farmer who supports us all, as we've learned over the last 2 to 3 years with the supply chain constraints and everything that we've lived through in COVID and all those issues. We need them to be strong so that we are all strong together. And I thank them for all that they do, and I thank everyone on this panel and in the industry at large for the collaborative efforts that they have so that we can heed this call, we can answer this call rather, and not just a haphazard fashion, but a highly strategic and profitable fashion for our farmers, our industry, and our country.
Thank you very much, Robert. There's a lot of insight in there, and there's a couple questions that rolled in, and we'll circle back to those, both on the product side and on the milk check side. and I think both are equally important. So as a reminder, those questions can be entered into the GoToWebinar control panel, and you, the audience, will direct our conversation in the second half of the hour. And before we hear from Patti Smith of Dairy America, let's go to another poll question. Aside from the USMCA, so United States-Mexico-Canada agreement in 2020, when was the last year the US entered a free trade pact or a free trade agreement? So select one of the answers there, 2012, 2014, 2016, and 2020. So we'll wait for the audience to go ahead and answer that poll question. When we were drafting the poll questions, I have to smile here at my coworker, Caitlin. The second one was 1014, and we probably only would have been able to talk to our Native Americans that were here 1,000 years ago, and I'm sure there was no free trade pacts across any entity at that point. So we are getting close to having half the audience enter this. It's a little bit of trepidation, not a normal question that gets asked, but I think it's so important. And our next guest, Patti, is going to talk about some of the reasons these are important. So let's go ahead and see what the audience said. We're just at the 50% mark. 46% of you got that right. 2012. That was the year the United States entered into a pair of single country trade agreements with Colombia and Peru. Then it took 8 more years before the United States, Mexico, Canada revamped an old North American free trade agreement to create the new US-Mexico trade agreement that went in effect in 2020. Our next guest, Patti Smith, will contend that trade barriers and tariffs are among the most limiting factors to growing US dairy product exports in the future. Patti joins our panel on DairyLivestream, having amassed over 30 years of leadership in food ingredients and dairy processing arena. In June of 2020, Patti became CEO of Dairy America. Dairy America supplies dairy products to over 60 countries around the globe, making it the world's largest skim milk powder supplier. Prior to joining Dairy America, Patti was CEO of Valley Milk in California and previously held executive leadership positions with Fonterra and Roquette America. Patti, how do we continue to build support for US dairy product exports on the global stage?
Well, Corey, first of all, thank you for having me on the panel today. And as both Megan and Rob have alluded to, it's been great to be as a part of this wider group and the thought process that comes into play in our whole industry. Yeah, as Rob alluded to, it's not the if, it's the how and also the when. And so really what we have to focus on when we start looking at that is what are our limitations today, and how do we get past those limitations to be able to grow substantially greater? And one of those alluded to in that poll question, when you look at it, 8 years to go to the UMCA, and you're now at 2022, so another 10 years from that, the last one. So if you look at it, that is a huge issue with U.S. to be competitive. And when we look at that, it's all about price and return to the farmer. It's also the competitiveness, and it goes into quality, goes into reliability, as Megan alluded to. But however, when we look at it, that big price component and reliability really comes back to trade agreements. So when we look at it, the countries we want to go to and the countries that we need to go to, we need to spread our wings, not go to the traditional countries that we've been exporting to, but be able to grow and grow with other countries. And through that, we need to have the opportunity of trade agreements and reduce tariffs. When we look at it and we compete against Oceania and the Europeans, in most cases, they have better tariff advantages than we do, many times in double-digit percentages. So that's significant dollars over millions of pounds of imports and exports. But with that said, we also have to encourage that as an industry, we fight for trade agreements and really just demonstrate where the advantages are. If we look at ourselves, we don't have the best trade agendas, and we're working on that as an industry to be able to do that. But if you look at other countries, such as Oceania and Europe, they're doing it all the time. They're looking at new opportunities and new trade. And we've got to stay in front of that and be at the forefront versus being a step behind. And that's how we'll be competitive. So with that, it's just one component of it. Obviously, there's a lot of things, as many people know, we dropped out of the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was mostly Southeast Asia driven. We've been able to benefit substantially through the Peru and Colombia that was, as mentioned, from 2012. And we've continued to grow with that as each year progresses. But we now need to look at those other countries around the globe, particularly in Southeast Asia, Middle East, and North Africa, where there's areas that they really do need our nutrition. And that drives me into my next point, really around what is the next challenge? It's around quality. It's around not only having reliability, but quality and the perception of U.S. dairy. And Rob alluded to it, it's not just about non-fat. It's moving up the value chain. It's doing those other products, if they be powders or non-powders and even liquids, but being able to be in that nutrition category that Megan alluded to. That's where the growth is. That's where we see the value, and that's where it's moving up the chain. And we need to be able to play in that space. Part of that's tariff related, but a lot of that is also perception. The U.S. dairy industry has historically had a perception of being lower quality, more commoditized. That's no longer the case. If you look at our new investments that have been made on the ground in the U.S., you look at the technology that we put into our dairy, as well as what all of our companies have done across the industry to increase awareness around quality. That's our next step. That's the next magnitude, is now to keep that momentum. We had a lot of momentum coming out of 2019 into 2020, really growing the view and the face of quality coming out of the U.S. dairy, and then we were hit by a global pandemic. And that kind of goes into my third point. What happened then? It was reliability. We hit a global supply chain crisis, and it made us look like, okay, now you've got the quality, but you can't reliably deliver it to us on an ongoing need. And Oceania was able to have less disruption because of location, as well as Europe. So the U.S. took a harder hit based on that. We are seeing some easing today, as we've all seen. But it's not good enough, right? We've got to continue to move forward with that. And the other piece of it is, it's not just what we need today. As we said, 17, 18%, we're going to be at 20%. Look at the dollars and the billions of dollars at 9.6 billion. We've now got to be proactively saying, what do we need for infrastructure? What do we need for transparency as we move into the future? And that becomes really, really critical, because if we compete against others, we have to look at what the ports of Singapore, what the other ports around the globe are able to do when it comes to transparency and capability. So it's impactful that we do something today about our supply chain and get back on track, but it's even more important that in the future, as we continue to grow, that we make sure that we have the infrastructure and the capability to support further growth. Because that is the key. When we look at the dairy industry and look at where our returns are, where we balance our solids, we need the exports and we need quality exports. And we're only going to be able to gain that through reliability and competitiveness, which really drives back to quality, supply chain capability, as well as tariffs and trade barriers and being competitive on the global marketplace and the global scale.
Patti, you bring up some very interesting here. Maybe we'll talk about it a little later in the second half, but you talk about infrastructure and growing that so that we can service it. And some of that infrastructure, certainly in the United States, and that's going to probably become a greater and greater issue if you marry the idea of infrastructure with what Robert was saying earlier with, as ethanol was shifted things on at the farm gate, now we have water. And if water drives cows to the Midwest region from, all the way from North and South Dakota down to Texas and the states to the, we got to get that product to the coast. So those are legitimate things that we need to be thinking about now as an industry. So we're going to go to one more poll question here before we hear from Chris Wolf. That poll question is this: if USDA forecasts come to fruition, how will the entirety of egg exports finish the year? So this is all egg exports: beef, soybeans, corn, dairy. Will we be a trade surplus or trade deficit? That's your first option. And then how much will it be? $4 billion deficit, $2 billion deficit, $2 billion surplus, or a $4 billion surplus? So this is building on a big number. If you were on our pregame broadcast here, we had a poll question earlier that we talked about what was the total U.S. egg exports projected to be. That number was 196 billion. So people are answering the question. Let's see what they say here, Chris. Well, our audience did get the correct answer here at 51%. A $4 billion surplus is what's being projected right now. And again, that's on a sales that are projected to be 196 billion. So we export 196 billion, we import 192 of all of ag products. And so we welcome Chris Wolf, Cornell University ag economist. Chris, you shared that dairy is moving, and Robert talked about that, from a supply-driven to a demand-driven market. Can you tell viewers what that means and how it will impact the dairy industry?
Thanks for having me. It's nice to be back, be with this group and talk about this topic. You know, it used to be the case, and I'm sure that Robert can relate to this, it used to be a lot easier to think about forecasting U.S. farm milk price because we didn't really need to worry about international markets. It was really domestic. I mean, sure, we considered what world grain markets were going to look like, but when it came to milk, the focus was domestic. And, you know, for a very long period of time there, U.S. dairy exports were relatively small, usually less than 5% of production. And at least in percentage terms, were largely offset by imports, although the mixes of what we exported and what we imported were very different products. And for many years, as kind of Patti alluded to, the exports revolved around balancing our markets between butter, fat, and protein, and particularly when the dairy price support program was relevant and purchasing, then we had to consider how those kind of surpluses might get taken care of. But since the price support program is no longer interfering and doesn't even exist with dairy product prices, the market, which for many products here, for storable dairy products, is international, has been determining our prices, and the result is that U.S. dairy products are very competitive, except for, we need to consider things like exchange rates and trade agreements, which is one place where we've maybe taken a step back on the trade agreements relative to our competitors in the last few years. So, if we think about the general public, if you were to ask them, I think a lot of people would say, well, U.S. consumption of dairy has been going down, and we know that that's of course incorrect, that perhaps they're thinking of beverage milk, but U.S. total dairy consumption has been consistently growing, through cheese, yogurt, butter, different creams, cream cheese, other products like that. It's been growing consistently, total consumption. But still, the exports have been an important part of balancing the market between the butter fat and the non-fat solids, and between the different product mix that we have. And as Megan pointed out, the production has been growing strongly, and really even more growth has been happening on the international side than it has been happening domestically. And part of that is what also Robert referred to, which is a movement from what the old days when we had kind of a supply-driven supply chain, which was we have some product, we need to find an outlet for it, let's find an outlet for it and move on, to where we are moving to now, which is demand-driven, which means that it's more of a pull instead of a push on these products. And so then we have to worry about relationships and quality and other factors that Patti and Robert and Megan have been talking about. So economically then, the international markets provide a new demand for our products and allow the quantity that we're producing to grow. And the result is that our product prices for many products are highly correlated with international prices, and we pay attention to the economic conditions in other countries, and we pay attention to exchange rates, we pay attention to shipping costs, and we pay attention to things like what's happening with at the ports and with rails and things like that. But then the other side of that is we also need to be concerned with what geopolitical disputes can do, and then we worry about things like what happens if we have a dispute with China or something else, and that spills over to affecting. So on the whole, I think that the exports are a really positive story for the U.S. dairy industry. But it does bring a different mix, and from my personal perspective, being selfish, it makes it a lot harder to forecast things than it used to be. But it's fun. It's fun to be watching these markets.
That is indeed true. It is fun to watch these markets. And earlier this week, when these reports come out, especially in tight supply situations, if you're a soybean farmer, those moved almost 75 cents per bushel in one day, just beyond changing yields. So this is a wild ride here. We got a number of questions that have come in here, and I've written some notes here because I kind of want to knit together a story. And this first question is going to go, it popped up while Robert was speaking, and we're going to turn that one over to Robert and Chris. And the question is, so we have a number of dairy farmers who are watching this dairy live stream. And so the question is very simple. With a significant increase of exports, will this value increase the blend price of milk? And I'll probably start with Robert here, because part of your discussion really started to talk about that. in terms of moving from commoditized product to building to a value-added chain, and that's really where this comes into is part of that answer, Robert.
That's an excellent question and also a very tricky one to answer from a macro standpoint because it's really a very detail-oriented question. It's not simply will exports increase or decrease the price of a milk check or a milk pool, depending where it's coming from. It's a question of what's being exported. And a big part of my hope is that what's being exported 10 years from today will be different than what's being exported today, right? Because of exactly what Chris was talking about, the shift from a push-pull relationship, a supply-demand driven relationship. As we invest strategically with long-term agreements with our customers, we're going to shift, I hope, we're planning as a UDA perspective and with others, to invest away from needing to move excess unwanted production into desired production up the value stream, right? Moving away from a low heat non-fat to a specialized high protein commoditized product. Seeing the world embrace their cheese consumption and knowing an increasing portion of that, as Megan touched on, is going to come outside the United States. Looking at the plants that have been built in the US over the last handful of years and what are coming in line over the next couple of years, largely being block and natural cheese production, right? Heeding the call not only of the domestic demand, but also the increasing international supply. And so I'd rather tackle that question while it's a great one and a valuable one, because inherently the most important thing is how do we return profitability to those that create the production that we have to market around the world? That is the question. I think the answer is not how do we do that just through exports, it's how do we do that through the right exports, and that takes partnership and long-term strategic investment. And so it should certainly continue to increase and add value to that milk check. Will it have the same increased value today that it will have in 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, and 10 years? No, because it should consistently increase because we should consistently improve our profitability associated with said inventories as we shift from an inventory sweeping mechanism to a choice mechanism with profitability attached to it.
Thank you, Robert. Chris, you heard the question. What would you add to that for speaking specifically to a dairy farmer who asked that question?
Yeah, so, if we're thinking about what effect do the exports have on, the mailbox price of the US dairy farmer, it's complicated to tease that out, but when we're letting markets work, and right now we're competitive, then the question is, what would that mailbox price have been if we didn't have that export outlet? And since we are competitively exporting these, the counterfactual is that the price would have been lower. And so it is, it is impacting positively. And I think that, that Robert is getting at an important part of the story. Europe and, Oceania had a kind of a head start on these international markets, right? They built some relationships and we kind of were a little bit behind there. But my sense is that we've done a lot of catching up, and Patti would be the best one to talk about this, and Megan, lots of catching up to where we've built those relationships, and now we can think of, instead of exporting just basic commodities, we can also think of more high value products.
Patti, do you want to jump into that?
Yeah, sure. No, I think it's really important, and I mean, both Chris and Robert have alluded to it. It's not just, it really is important. What would it look like if we didn't have those exports, right? And I think that's what comes back to that ultimate price back to the farmer. But I think the other piece of it, absolutely. I mean, if you look at Oceania in particular and Europe, but let's focus on Oceania and we look at Southeast Asia, they've had that advantage. Obviously, they're also producing a lot more dairy products than what they consume within their countries. So therefore, they have had that advantage, and it was long-term relationships. So once the brand was ingrained into those markets, it was very difficult to get it out. And the US was behind because what we typically exported in the early days, if you go back to, the early, late 90s and 2000s, and you look at the trend and the trajectory, it was exactly to the points already been made. We were just exporting excess products. We weren't necessarily strategically saying we're going after this market or this market or this market. Today, that's a different playing field. We are building those relationships. We have built those relationships, and we've strategically taken advantage of where we do have equality or close to equality in trade. So you've seen the US dairy industry, obviously, what is growing over the years. If you look at what goes into the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, and of course, China. But it's having that balance and having that widespread capability to be able to not have all the eggs in one basket. per se. And I think that's the key thing is being able to now build upon those relationships. And they're not just multinational relationships, they're regional relationships within those individual countries. And that doesn't just apply to Southeast Asia, that applies to Latin America as well as the Middle East. And I think that's really where it's key is we're building those, we're growing on those, and we're further developing those. But we are behind the other countries where export was a major play, and it's now becoming a more strategic play for the U.S. dairy industry.
Thank you, Patti. We have a number of thoughtful questions coming in from the audience. And reminder, you can use the GoToWebinar control panel to enter those questions. And this one just came in, and I know Megan can definitely answer it. She's done a lot of work in this area with her teammates. Question pertaining to international cheeses. Are these new products entirely or research to understand what products are most interest to the consumers out there? So talk about that. And the answer is maybe not the same in every market, of course. Megan?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I can appreciate that question. And really, the research that USDEC conducted at the end of last year, it was much more about what do consumers actually want from a good tasting cheese. We know that across the globe, we run a study every year that indicates that taste is the #1 purchase driver of cheese in every market that we're tracking. So we know taste is important, but what is a good tasting cheese? So we did glean some insights about the most common or popular varietals, and as I mentioned, those align real well with the US portfolio, but it was less about the varietals that consumers are actually wanting. They're actually, in their taste testing, they were unable to see labels or packaging of any kind, and they were simply tasting the cheeses and saying what they liked and did not like. And then, of course, there's the methodology goes way beyond that, but in simplistic form, we were learning things like in South Korea, for instance, color really matters with cheese. So white cheese is perceived to be fresh, and fresh was the most important attribute for consumers when choosing any cheese. Milk profiles was really important in this market too. Very different than what we saw come through in Saudi Arabia, where we saw more processed cheese. They prefer mild cheese, but it wasn't quite as important to have that milk forward profile. So there's a lot of different taste, texture differences of what consumers are looking for. And to kind of wrap that up to your point, possibly this could lead to product innovation in the future, but kind of a shorter term solution or how we can maximize and activate on the insights from this research as well is really all about marketing and messaging, because we're all familiar with the placebo effect. And if we see something that says mild or creamy, these attributes that consumers are looking for, if we can include more white on packaging, in South Korea, attributes like that really allow us to customize how we're even marketing our current varietals versus necessarily having to innovate with some new varietal, although that does have some exciting potential for the future.
Thank you, Megan. The next question here, I think we're going to start with Patti on this one. And maybe turn to Robert. Given that Europe and other important milk production countries are under pressure by the quote unquote green initiative, which has reduced cow numbers and milk production, do we expect US producers to be affected in a similar way? So that's the question.
No, it's a very, very unique question and a very valid question, right? And I think the key thing is if we look at it across the U.S. in a broad sense, especially at the farm level all the way through the production level, and Rob can speak to that a little bit more, even just from having the assets on the ground. But it is something that's been very focused on in the U.S. from all green initiatives and environmental initiatives. So we have a lot of things and a lot of different programs. If it's been through sustainability programs that have been put on through industry groups, but also the farm program and things of that nature, is taking awareness a lot of the green initiative up front. And then if you look at some of the majoring dairy states, obviously if you take out and look where I'm based in California, we already had a lot of environmental drivers and things that were in place. I'll say it nicely. I live in the state of California, right? I'm always worried about the environment and electricity, and will I have power and water tomorrow, right? But I think we've been very focused on that. I mean, water is not a new issue, energy is not a new issue, and the whole green or environmental friendly is not a new issue. So will there be impact? There will be impact, but I do actually think the U.S. is ahead of the curve in many instances, if you take it on a whole weighted average type perspective. And there's been a lot of effort, and the large co-ops, the large producers, and the large companies are definitely putting their statements out there, as well as the multinationals and regional players making the statement that they're going to move forward with this. So I think is there going to be impact? Yes. Hopefully not as great as what we've seen in some other areas because of some of the stuff that's already been initiated across the U.S. So Rob probably has some more details, especially from an Arizona perspective and different things there, as well as production. But that's my viewpoint.
Yeah, what I'd add to that is, all these things are about suspending judgment. It's not about right or wrong. It's about what are the economic incentives and the opportunities within the system. And we in the US have chosen to tackle this green initiative from the opposite perspective of our counterparts. They have chosen the stick. We have chosen the carrot. So they're being very forceful. They're mandating changes, and there is a strict stick penalty for lack of adherence. We have gone the other route. And again, it's not about right or wrong, but we have gone the other route. We have incentivized people to choose to move down a certain path in a constructive, time-oriented fashion relative to the economic incentives in which they're chasing. That has meant that we are going to move in that direction in a different rate of change, a different pace, and also a different timeline that allows us to kind of control our own destiny a little bit more with our capitalist mindset of profitability attached to it. So in the end, while we'll move in a similar fashion, I think we'll come out of it much more profitably over a long term than our counterparts overseas.
Thank you. Chris, here's a loaded question. It's a short one, but it's a loaded one.
Right.
Do federal orders facilitate or constrain dairy product exports?
Well, they probably do a little bit of both. They definitely, many years ago, right, there was an allegation from, I think it was Japan, that the federal milk marketing orders amounted to an export subsidy the way they were set up, but that got knocked down in court. We're going to have lots of discussions about milk marketing orders, I think, in the next 2 years, and part of the discussions are going to be, are they incentivizing the right thing? Are they incentivizing the products to move to the highest value uses? Are they incentivizing innovation, and what's the proper number of classes and stuff? But I don't think the federal milk marketing orders are a primary driver on what we've seen at this point in time with respect to international markets. I guess would be my short answer. There's other factors that are bigger.
Megan, next question for you. Can you talk about what types of consumers we should be looking at as a U.S. dairy community to reach globally in the coming years? We're reaching consumers now, but where are the trend lines? What kind of products are they going to be looking for?
That's a great question, Corey. And I think, from a US DEC perspective, typically how we're looking at the markets is more on a market by market basis versus being able to segment like we do here domestically and learn more about each consumer type. But I would say some of those macro trends that we talked about earlier should definitely be influential when we're looking at the trend lines and what consumers will be looking for. We are kind of diving deep into what are the main trends globally with consumers that are driving dairy demand. So more so than focusing on a specific consumer segment, I recommend having strong messaging around health and wellness, especially as it relates to nutrition, as it relates to gut health. This has come through in our research. Consumers in various markets are very, connected to what, gut health and how that relates to their immune health, which we know is so top of mind right now as well. There's certainly some really good data behind yogurt and the connection with gut health. The consumer awareness there is pretty strong. Beyond health and wellness, I would say sustainability is definitely a trend to make sure that we're continuing to address both on a consumer and a B2B customer level. It's a purchase driver on both levels now, and we know that that'll just continue to grow in importance. Something that's another kind of interesting trend to really monitor is around snacking and this concept of healthy indulgence. For products, when we think about products like permeate that show up in confectionery and baked goods in international markets, being able to really understand that consumers are now saying that it's okay to indulge a little bit, right? All the volatility in the world, all of the uncertainties, the pandemic, it's okay to indulge, but consumers want to feel good about that indulgence. And so, things like, I don't know if you've seen this, but start looking at packaging and you'll notice, like on Pop-Tarts, it'll say, highlight maybe the vitamins and minerals that are in something that you might historically or classically see as an indulgent item. And so I would say, again, more so focusing on some of those bigger trends that we have found to be relevant in so many of our priority export markets, and how dairy, serves as a solution or fits right into those trends to meet consumer needs.
Thank you, Megan. What I really like about DairyLivestream is the collective audience we bring together here. And just a point of clarification, doubling back on that federal milk marketing order question. Tom Suber, who was a longtime CEO of the U.S. Dairy Export Council for almost 20 years, just wanted to share that the European Union was the one who hypothesized, and hypothesize is the right word, that federal milk market orders were a subsidy, and we know that not to be true.
Right. Thanks, Tom.
Yeah, I appreciate that coming in from him. The next question here, and we can turn this to Patti and Robert and Chris here, I think. And I want to set it up. I'm going to read the question and I'll set it up. In order to capture additional sales internationally, how much product needs to be produced to meet the European standard of identity versus, for example, the U.S. Code of Federal Regulations, or what we would call CFR, standards of production? So we do have customers that are used to getting product on a certain standard. We're the new kids on the block and hard charging. But talk about sales, fulfilling sales on the international stage. There's multiple standards out there. Patti, do you want to grab that first, or does Robert want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. I think the key thing, it's the multiple standards, and it's not just going against the European standard, but alluding a little bit back to Megan's comment earlier, when we look at what audience we're targeting, it's not just nutrition, right? It also goes into that indulgence, which is confectionery and things like that. So it's really getting and changing the mindset of when we're making our products. In most cases, we can make them. There are some, equipment, and if you look at powder particularly, which I deal with every day, obviously there's some dryers where if you don't have the, indirect burner and things of that nature, there's nitrite and nitrate standards which impact. But if you look at it, it's really getting able to grade and get that awareness of those extra criteria that need to be there. A lot of that being in more strict or stringent micro requirements. If you look at it from a be serious, so things of that nature. So it's really digging a little bit deeper into what would be the standard CFR. This meets good manufacturing practices. This meets GMPs, things of that nature. So it's moving into that. But if you look at it from a U.S. dairy perspective, particularly if you look at it on the nutrition side, and going into some of the confectionery or snack side, because of the ultimate applications, as you now look at, even US wise, if it's nutrition powders, if it's beverages, if it's bars, there's already been kind of an uptick in those requirements, if it's the level of testing or the actual testing that's being required. So it's of top of mind, but it's more of a mindset of being able to prove that we can perform that and be able to make those products in our facilities across the US, which if you look at it, the quality standards have increased substantially. So, with the exception of a few parameters, they are challenging and difficult, but it's a mindset and really a shift to say, we're going to test for those more stricter categories and not necessarily limit what can and can't be exported, but be able to say these products made are of export quality and capability and making it from day one to that point.
Robert?
I'll chime in and add, this isn't Field of Dreams. We don't want to build it believing they'll come. We've done that with our milk supply for 100 years. That really didn't behoove us, right? We don't want to build it and then figure out what to do with it. We want to strategically budget and balance exactly what we're doing. And we want to build with our customers in a strategic fashion. So how much milk do we need to produce? How much of what product do we need to produce? Those are things that we need to do in concert with our customers, and where and when we need to invest in new facilities or new technologies, we need to do that potentially in joint investment collaboration with certain customers or certain regions or certain governments. But we need to always do that with long-term contracts in mind, because we're doing it as a partner. We're not doing it on the belief, we're not doing it on the punt, we're not doing it on the gamble. These are strategic long-term investments, and they should be done in concert together as part of a long-term plan. And so the answer to your question, if you're looking for specific numbers, what's the quantity of milk or what's the quantity of a certain product production that we need to do X, Y, or Z with, that answer is a discovery process that we should have as an ongoing factoid.
Thank you, Robert. We're going to end the webcast with the very first question that came in, and everybody's going to give their best answer to it. And we're going to start with Professor Chris Wolf here. The question is this: we're going to fast forward to 2032, 10 years from now, 2032. And the question is this: can you speculate what % of our milk production will be exported in 10 years from now, 2032? Chris?
25%.
25%. Robert?
I'll go a shade over that and say close to a third.
Wow, okay. Patti?
Well, just because I have to, be very optimistic considering my whole world's export, right? No, I think we'll be around, I'd say 35 to 38%.
And Megan, what say you?
Well, I'll say I'm glad our economist is not sitting right next to me here to hear my answer, but I would say 30% I would be definitely in the realm of possibilities.
Mm-hmm. Hey, that is balanced based on how much customers around the globe will purchase and how much the cows in the United States will produce. So that's two big factors go into that. So thank you for that. Our next dairy live stream will air on October 12th, that's a Wednesday, and the title will be, Will Dairy Have a Social License to Produce Milk? And it'll air at the same time, 11 o'clock Central Time here, and it'll be archived on our Hoard's Dairyman YouTube channel and all of our podcast channels the very next day. And just like that webcast, if you heard this one and you think a friend or colleague should listen to it or would glean some good things from it, tomorrow we will have all the audio and video files up and running. And then on Monday and Thursday of next week, Hoard's Dairyman Intel will have vignettes of some of the great comments from Megan, Patti, Robert, and Chris in that newsletter, our e-newsletter. And if you haven't subscribed to that, go to www.hoards.com and you can sign up for the e-newsletter there. So I look forward to seeing you on our next webcast of Dairy Livestream on October 12th. And on behalf of Megan Sheets, Robert Chesler, Patti Smith, and Chris Wolf, I'm Corey Geiger, and I thank you for joining us today. I wish you all have a good day. Goodbye, everybody.